Okay. So a lot of you have particles that are like flying out of something, and so far we're using force fields to like kind of push them around. Let's pretend I have a force field on here and I'm just like blowing them down. But you could also have it like collide with things. So we have like a roof. And if I want right now the particles are going through it, but if I want the particles to collide with it, you click the roof, you go to the physics tab and you set collision, and now they're like bouncing off like crazy. But with that roof selected, I could turn on particle friction. Let's see what happens if they bounce still. So they're still bouncing. We need to dampen that. So particle dampening, let's turn that up to 1, and they're just landing on it. But I don't really like them to land and stop, so I'll dampen them a bit. I'll add some randomness, and maybe I'll dampen them even more. So I think maybe if we turn down the gravity a bit, the bounce would be less. So if we wanted it to be like snow, but this looks like marbles, basically, if you wanted to pour marbles onto something. So some of you have particles that are being pushed out into places. I would say feel free to make obstacles in their path to like kind of knock them around and have them, yeah, just obstacles. So yeah, all you do is you make an object, you go physics, and then hit this collision. Sometimes you might want to like, instead of them interacting with this, as soon as they touch that, the particles disappear. That can be helpful if you have an animation with like 1,000,000 particles. It'll be easier to render it because the computer will stop trying to calculate that other 500,000 particles that have already gone through the roof. Yeah. Generally with particles, the more the better. So you like want to see what your computer can get away with. But usually the more you add, the slower it goes and the longer it takes to render. Okay, so give that a shot. Let's resume this. So once again, I just want my particles coming from 2 specific vertices. And I have my 2 vertices picked, this one and this one. And I'm going to create a new vertex group and hit assign. The weight is going to be at 1 by default. I hit assign. I could even label this like blasters. You don't have to. It could just be called group. But if you go into weight paint mode, you can see there's like everything's blue and those are kind of red. So now if we go to our emitter, and I might not have an emitter on this yet. Okay, so let's make an emitter. And I don't care about the faces. I just want it coming from the vertices. And now it's coming from like the whole ship. But if you scroll down to down here, so we've looked at field weights, but you can do vertex groups. And if I choose the density, it's looking for a group. Density just means like where I want the particles to clump at. If I choose the blasters and go back, now they're like spraying out of those, and it looks like a very kind of like pathetic TIE fighter. If I increase let's set this N to like 120. So if I set the normal up to like, let's just drag it out. Okay, so now we're getting some like blasting. But if you drag it all the way up, I think it stops at like 100, maybe. So this value right here, you can actually key in higher values like 200, and it'll still work. The other thing is, let's put it back on its path, and let's see kind of what it's looking like. So it's just like crazy machine gun, which actually is pretty awesome. They should do that in the new Star Wars movie, just like it, blasting like that. Anyways, so that's ridiculous for your normal TIE fighter. So like maybe I would want it to start shooting at frame 28 and I want it to end by frame like 70, and I only need like 15 particles, like 15 shots, so even less, like 8. So I can visualize those particles differently. Like let's say I want those particles to line up with something. So I'm not going to give it an object yet, but I'm going to say instead of having it be this little halo rendered, I'm going to make it a cross, and I'm going to increase the cross to that. So you can actually like make sure your bullets are hitting a target as it's moving. That's just for visualizing it as you're like animating it. But now let's give it an actual thing to render. So I'm going to give it an icosphere. I'm going to set it to 1 in subdivisions over here, so it's really low poly. I can smooth it. I'll give it an emission shader. And if you want the glow of the emission and the compositing to work, you got to give your emission shader like a strength of 50, so it should be pretty bright. And now I'll click my particles. I'll go to object here and choose icosphere, and instead of the cross we'll go back to rendered. And now I have these like kind of piddly little icospheres shooting out, as you can see. So down here you can increase the size of them so they're a little bigger, and you could even make them a little random as they come out. And let's see what it looks like just at this moment. It probably won't look great. So at first render, you might get a little discouraged, like, oh, this isn't looking very good. You know, you have this like little dot there. But let me turn on my, I'm going to turn on motion blur. So down here, and because I'm rendering with a, whatever it's called, graphics card, I'm just bumping that up. So now with motion blur, that kind of piddly looking particle now is going to have some more personality. And that ship looks crazy. The stars are stuck because the cameras, the only thing moving are the ship and that. And then if we go here to the compositor, we use nodes. You add a little glare, filter, glare, you switch it to fog. And all of a sudden, what was a piddly icosphere is now starting to look like a pretty decent blaster. Yeah, okay. So let's look at 2 more things you can do with particles. So like I have 2 forces going on this particle right now. I have this turbulence, and then I have this harmonic. So it's like kind of drawing them in, and that looks pretty cool. Typically what they say is, like if you want this effect where the particles are like, they kind of look like they're hitting something and moving. So normally what you do with turbulence is you want to add some keyframes to it. So like you animate the turbulent field, and you can see that, so here they're starting to hit something, but if I move the turbulence around, like the field itself that's influencing it will move. So you can add keyframes to, like, I'll just add a keyframe to this rotation here, and then maybe I'll like spin it on the z-axis a bunch by the end of it. So now I have like a spinning field here that doesn't seem to be doing anything. Maybe the best thing is to not do rotation, but like just move it up on the z-axis. So go to the end of it, and like let's move it up to there. So now the particles are kind of being pushed along slightly differently. And then it's good to like duplicate, and we could even like, so I just duplicated that turbulent, and maybe I'll put it here, and then change the size to be like 1, and maybe change the strength to be like just a different strength. Let's try 50. So now we have 2 forces to make this particle simulation even more complex. So that's one little tip. Feel free to like layer the forces on top of each other to get different results. And then instead of adding like an object, you can add what's known as a metaball. And metaballs can be used for a lot of things, not just particles. But watch what happens when I duplicate this metaball, and I'm going to move it on the like x-axis. Notice how there's like a sphere of influence. When they get close enough, they start touching, and you adjust that sphere in this tab up here. And I think it's kind of low resolution now. Like the rendered is going to be 0.2, which the smaller the better. So if we switch this to 0.2, you can see it has it like it's even more responsive. So what if we make the particles the metaball, and it behaves slightly differently, so it might not work at first, but I'm going to go to object, and it's called imball, and it's like, oh, it just disappeared. The metaball has to be on the same layer, so I'm going to move it to layer 1, and I'm just going to hide it basically from view. And now we're getting like all these crazy glitchy things, and that is just because we need to, with our original metaball selected, we need to like increase the quality to maybe, let's try 0.075, and we're starting to get something like that. If we tab into edit mode in the metaball and maybe scale it up, or you could scale up the particles a bit. I'm clicking that plane that was emitting particles, just crank up the size. And my computer is starting to really slow down. Let's try 1. Maybe 0.5 would have been good. Anyways, once we get like, you can make a sculpture with these metaballs and stop the particle system, and then it just becomes this weird like globular structure that you might want. So I'm going to pause this recorder, and we'll just. Okay, so I had to turn down the number of my particles, and I'm just like, you can just increase the size a little bit within the emitter, and I'm getting something kind of cool now. If I go to the metaball itself, and once again kind of increase the resolution to like 0.2, like let's try 0.1. Sure, this is good enough for me. So we'll let this kind of solve itself. Okay, that's fine. So now with that selected, with this object selected, if we go to, when you create a particle system, it's in the modifier stack, and if I hit convert, it should convert it to, here, one second, I have to, okay, third time's the charm. So ignore what I said about converting the particle. Just click on your metaballs, and if you can convert this to a mesh. So you can shift convert to, or Alt C does the same result. So Alt C, and I'm going to convert it to mesh. And now I have this like crazy mesh that I never would have been able to make on my own. And you can go into like sculpt mode. I'm not a huge sculptor, but FYI, there's a mirror lock on symmetry, so it like starts to, you can see I'm painting on one side, but it's doing it on both, so you can like turn that off. If you hold control, you can like cut into it. So there's a lot you can do with particles. Let's just see what it looks like if you render something like this. So it has an interesting look. I think it has a purpose. I haven't found one for it yet, but. So I shouldn't be wasting your time with more metaball stuff, but here could be a use of it. The thing about metaballs is motion blur doesn't work, but if we turn this to a glass shader, it could look cool, maybe. Let's see if it, or let's try glossy. We'll do glass. I really don't use metaballs a lot, but I do think they're pretty cool.